I let the slide sit just for a little bit because it sets out everything that we're going to be talking about in the next few weeks, months. Design and architecture are broken. Not my words. And while I think there is significant substance to it, I think there are also some terrible assumptions in it. But nonetheless, it passes across a sentiment which I think a lot of architects share. So the outcome of this survey done by Dezeen speaks to a broken architecture and design industry. I think that's a better definition. And I don't want to give too much away at this point because I think that should hopefully become self-evident as we move through the ensuing weeks. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dezeen magazine, founded in 2006 with a monthly readership of over 3 million. But what I think is important about what Dezeen does is, because of its operation from London and New York and Shanghai, is receiving inputs that represent perhaps some of the biggest markets that you can find globally. And so that gives you a pretty good picture of sentiment within the profession. I love this illustration. I've used it so many times in my lectures. Vitruvius presenting his thesis to the emperor. And it's possibly the first known example of a PowerPoint presentation, although in this case it's a finger point presentation. My name's Llewellyn van Wyk. I will be exploring these issues arising from that rather provocative statement by Dezeen about the architecture being broken. And we'll do so, as I've suggested, across a number of lectures down the line. And so we will start this particular one with a local situational analysis. It is going to be about South Africa today, and we'll explore, using some of Dezeen's information, survey results, and other works, what the comparative situation might be in other markets. We start with income pressure in the South African architectural practice. That's a good question. Why would you start with income? It's from my reading of, particularly from social media, where architects are speaking about themselves and speaking about their practices. The issue is never much about income or lack thereof, but rather competition for income, and then shifts quite quickly to things like competitive pricing and people in the market that shouldn't be in the market, and all those kinds of things. But I think there's a good reason to start with income. Professional stress really begins with theory. That's not what's going to cause stress. It's going to cause you some consideration and thought, but it's not going to necessarily cause you stress. What causes stress in practice is income pressure, because it shapes risk tolerance, it compresses your time for judgment, it incentivizes scope erosion, and ultimately it weakens professional autonomy. So if we're going to understand current pressures on South African markets or other markets, we need to start with the economics of practice. And there's two parts to this equation. The first is, what is the size of the professional market? So if we look at data from 2026, SACAP reports approximately 11,500 registered persons across all categories. We do need to remember that that represents registrations, not necessarily full-time equivalent practitioners. So it doesn't say these are full-time, it doesn't say it's private, it doesn't necessarily say that architectural income is the primary livelihood. So the 11,500 is a big number, and we have to sort of trim it down to see how many people are actually in that practice space. The second part of the equation then is what is the size of the building economy? And I think you can get a sense of where this is going. If we take the size of the building economy and divide it by the size of the practicing profession, then you can get a sense of income per person. So the most recent reporting year from Stats South Africa for 2024, the total value of buildings completed in South Africa was approximately 38.1 billion. Just perhaps a little pause here. So the two stats you can get from Statistics South Africa is the value of buildings completed, and you can get the value of building plans approved. Both of these figures are tricky to work with. The value of building plans completed doesn't necessarily mean that it was started and completed in that year. Bigger projects might take 2 years, 3 years, more. Similarly, the value of building plans approved might be that the plan is approved, but it hasn't actually been executed into construction work and may not be executed into construction work, possibly the next year or perhaps indefinitely. So neither of these gives you a neat, precise as one would like, of building value for a particular financial year. Tellingly, this figure for 2004, and this already sets the alarm bells ringing, it represents a decline of approximately 14% compared to 2023. Probably your 2025 is not going to look much better. So bear this in mind as we're moving forward, that we are looking at a declining economy and therefore looking at declining construction spend. So if we were to move beyond those two, why would one do that? Because the completion data probably underestimates the profession. Likewise, building plans approved would underestimate the profession. And the problem is, there's a number of problems. The first is lag. That buildings completed in 2024 were most likely designed in 2022. So it is a kind of a rear view mirror look at income. Secondly, there's this leakage factor. Not every building plan is passed becomes a building, but at least for if you were working for plans approved, each architect or technologist gets paid something for the design. Doesn't really help us too much because those are two different things. And then we sit with the supervision gap. Only a fraction, probably, of residential projects move to full service. In fact, it would be interesting to know how many architects actually deliver full service. So trying to get around this as best as I could, the solution was to shift the calculation to VAT receipts. That would give us a better picture for a year, and then work with building plans passed to kind of capture work in progress value. So if we do that, if we take the VAT output for 2024, and you can get that from Stats SA, then it's about 5.5 billion. If you look at the value of building plans passed, then that would be 4.6 billion. And how I got to that was then looking at that 39 billion in construction and taking a 4% average fee on private spend. So the 5.5 and the 4.6 would suggest that there's a reasonable degree of accuracy in that. If you look at professional census, and these would be looking at higher level numbers, data, again from Stats SA. Then you're looking at an estimated annual pool of 13.2 billion, but the 13.2 billion represents the total design economy. So that's got all your engineering works in as well. So you've got to kind of take that 13.2 billion and try to extract from it what might be the architectural component of it. And that, again, you're going to be using some form of percentage to get that sense. So 4.5, 4.6, 5.5 would seem reasonable. Deciding what the actual fee is per architect becomes even more problematic. So we can take gross revenue per registered professional, and that's just based on that 5.5 billion private fee pool divided by 8.5, say 8.5 thousand professionals. If you take out those that are not in practice, that are in education, that are working for government departments, etc., etc. So you would be looking at a professional income somewhere around 620,000. That would be an average. That's just the straight size of income, size of practices or practitioners, and doing that equation. If you were then to take that as a gross fee and using the 30-40-30 rule for overheads, production, and so on and so forth, then you would get a net average income somewhere in the order of 186 to 248,000, which looks scary, but my guess is probably highlights the struggle of a number of small practices compared to the larger corporate sector salaries. Not sure. Then we need to also look at the reality of the full service myth, because that affects that percentage, right? So again, if we work on a 70-30 split, 70% of the market is partial services. You're looking at high volumes, you're looking at low margins, probably a flat fee structure. And perhaps then 30% of the market being full services, which are your low volume, high margin, percentage based, would be your shopping centers and your big office parks and so on and so forth. So that then also begins to influence where the money is going, who's actually getting the money. There is this draftsperson ceiling, and I know this is a contentious point in a number of architectural markets, where architects are forced to price against a wide field of professional service providers for particularly residential work, which effectively caps the average income for small firms. So the profession is increasingly sustained by feasibility consulting and commercial work. But to try and get almost a flat fee in for a particular service rather than your typical architectural services. So the statistical reality of architectural income, if we try to narrow it down as best as we can, moving from raw averages to weighted market dynamics, then we could say there's a total registered professionals of 8,500, and we can take off from that the public corporate sector and just making a rough 20% guess there. So we're left with 1,722 people coming out of that pool. So estimated private fee earners of, say, 7,000. 7,000, 7,500. At the end of the day, you'll see it actually doesn't make a significant difference. We are looking at order of rather than precise income. And we can then work on that 5.5 billion as a basic fee pool. We can say we recognize that in those statistics, for example, particular value of building plans completed and value of building plans approved doesn't capture the rational design work that some architects might be doing, the fire certificates that some people might be doing, the energy studies that some people might be doing, the feasibility studies, which I can recall from my time in practice was a big component of what we did. So that's not there. So we're adding, if we let's say we add 15% to it, then your pool has gone from 5.5 billion to 6.3 billion. Then we have to separate the mean versus the median gap. And if we look at the statistical mean, then we're looking at about 888,000 gross revenue per architect. But if we look at the market median, so that recognizes that we have the 70-30 split, then probably your market median typical for a gross revenue for an architect is somewhere around 450,000. So that is assuming, and I think it's probably fairly reflective of the South African architectural market, that it is bimodal in as much as we have high-performing corporate tier and a subsistence tier. And it's that subsistence tier that kind of locked into that fee war, not helped by competitive bidding and all those other wonderful things. Where does the money actually sit then? Now again, we're back to annual average, and I don't actually think there is such a thing as an annual average. It's like saying the annual temperature, the average temperature of the sea is 23 degrees, but it's really seldom that you go to the sea and you experience 23 degrees. But let's work with that. So your candidate architects, based on these calculations and permutations, around about 240 to 360,000 a year. Your professional architect somewhere between 420 and 540,000, and then your director's principal somewhere between 900,000 and 1.5 million. What's really interesting here is that the value of buildings completed tells us about the health of the construction industry. And the value of the VAT receipts and plans passed tells us about the survival of the architectural profession. Those two numbers are really indicative of what's going on in this market. Really important to understand that little dance. Two things presented itself to this response. The first was, if we were to take the values that a bank would take into account for granting, for example, a mortgage and or a vehicle finance, what would a person need to, more particularly what would an architect need to earn to afford a median house price, 1.6 million, and that's data from this year, and your top selling SUV, which by the way is a Toyota Cross. It's not the fanciest car in the world, and nor in South Africa, is about 450,000. And we looked at bank affordability rules. So for a mortgage, it would be about 30% of gross income. For a motor car, it's about 15% of gross income. So taking the 30% rule, because that's what the bank is going to do, you would require to own a median price house and a top-selling SUV. In other words, it's the most popular one, by implications, the one that's the most affordable. Your required gross annual income would have to be somewhere around 800,000 a year. And we can now say, well, based on that, and let's again make an assumption and say that you are charging out at 4%. So for that 800,000 at 4%, each practicing architect would need to be completing around about 20 million rands worth of buildings every year. I don't know how many people are doing that. And that's before overheads and tax and abortive work and work at risk and scope constrictions and erosion and so on and so forth. So that was an alarming realization for me, that it may well be that there are many professionals out there who are unable on their own to afford a medium price house and a reasonably priced motor car. And probably that applies to a number of people. And so you then start getting into things like double earners in the house, because that's the only way you can afford it. The second thing to do would be to reverse engineer this. And then to say to structurally support middle class income, we're talking middle class, we're talking just median stuff for practicing architects as a group. The South African building economy would need to deliver 800,000 per person times 7,500 practitioners to get a 6 billion people. So using a 4% fee rate, the building value required every year would have to be 150 billion per year in total value of completed buildings if we were to work that back into the Stats SA numbers. That is 3.9 times larger than the 2024 completed building estimate of 38 billion. There's the rub. We can cut these numbers either which way we want. The 4% is too high, the 4% is too low. There's more practicing architects, there's less practicing architects. The fee pool is higher, the fee pool is lower. We can go around this little dance until we exhaust ourselves. We're not really going to get it unless we can secure VAT receipts from each practicing architect, and the chances of that's not very good. But this tells the story. This gap illustrates that the current building throughput is not just constrained, but an order of magnitude smaller than what would be required to sustain a structurally healthy profession. Even under generous assumptions. Again, playing with the numbers, upper percentage, down a percentage, more practicing, less practicing. Average gross income falls below survival thresholds for many professional practitioners. Median outcomes would probably be lower, not higher, if we were to shift from average to median. And importantly, and I've been here, it does not describe failure. It describes structural scarcity. And that is where the pressure begins. We can argue with each other about whether there's too many people in the profession or not. We can argue about whether competitive bidding is the bad guy or not. We can argue about the profession not being appreciated or not. This is where the pressure begins. And if we want to unlock all those other issues that form the backbone of social media discussions, we need to get our head around understanding where the pressure begins. So what do the models show and not show? The models do not show income equality within the professions. We have all those categories. So I don't know what, when you start working at that granular level, what those incomes are going to look like. It does not show firm concentration. Where are the big firms? How much of the work value are they taking out? It does not show cross-subsidization between firms that may be practicing internationally. And it doesn't show the public versus private skew. Again, I think if you put all of those factors in, it would further depress median outcomes. What it also does not show is income inequality between male and female. The elephant in the room. Okay. What it does show is something simpler. There is not enough money in the building economy to support an architectural profession as currently structured. I want to emphasize that because I'm not saying anything else than there is a structural problem. And don't misread me on this one. As currently structured. I think that's where our attention needs to go. Given the realities of the South African construction industry and the state of the profession, whether it's broken or not, how do we restructure this profession to make it viable? Why does this matter? Under sustained income pressure, scope narrows. First thing that happens. Judgment is compressed, mostly because of time, mostly because of lower skilled people being involved in critical decision making, because of competitive bidding and the need to undercut on a competitive bidding market. Risk is externalized. You try to shift risk from the practice to somewhere else. And ultimately, all of those three leads to weakening professionalism. Again, these pressures are structural, not moral. So we need to understand this context before discussing things like professionalism in the 21st century. What does that even look like? Before we get onto, well, if that's the case and it needs to be restructured, what does that say about education? What does it say about technology? And then the second elephant in the room, AI. And I'm not going to talk about that right now. So South Africa is not unique. I started with South Africa because that's the market I operated in. That's the one I understand the best. But the next lecture, we'll have a look at this local picture within the broader international context where similar pressures have been observed for decades. Whether that's the UK, whether that's the States, this is not new. So in the second lecture, we'll go and test some of those markets, not to this level of data because I don't want to spend all my time going through statistics, but to see what is the market reflecting, what are people talking about, what are organizations like Dezeen, what is their survey results in telling us, and others. Please hit the like button and subscribe. It would be good to know how many people are actually engaging with this, and if solely to try and get a bigger discussion going. Until next lecture, take care.